For months, people became increasingly concerned about Ethan. Not because of anything dramatic, not because of any visible crisis, because he kept carrying a small notebook everywhere, and he wrote in it constantly in meetings, when no one was speaking, at coffee shops, mid-sentence, as if something had just occurred to him that couldn't wait. During conversations, sometimes pausing mid-laugh to scribble something down before looking back up like nothing had happened, sometimes after someone said a single, ordinary sentence, sometimes while sitting completely alone, staring at a wall, then suddenly writing for 2 or 3 minutes straight. The behavior became impossible to ignore. Friends started exchanging glances when he reached for it. Coworkers began speculating quietly in the break room. His mother called more often than usual, asking questions that weren't really questions, the kind designed to test for cracks. Everyone built a theory, and none of the theories were kind. Some thought Ethan was depressed and using the notebook as some private spiral of self-pity. Some thought he was becoming obsessive, maybe even paranoid. Some thought he was documenting people, keeping some kind of file on the people in his life, the way a person does before they finally explode at everyone they've been quietly resenting. Some thought he was simply having a breakdown, and the notebook was the last visible symptom before something worse happened. What made it stranger was that Ethan himself was changing, and not in the direction anyone expected from a man supposedly falling apart. He became calmer. The Ethan people had known for years was quick to take offense, quick to defend himself, quick to fill silence with whatever justification came to mind first. That Ethan started disappearing. In his place was someone who could sit through criticism without flinching, who could absorb a joke at his expense without needing to win the room back. He made decisions faster, and stranger still, he seemed to regret fewer of them. There was a stillness to him that unsettled people who had known him as someone always slightly bracing for impact. His sister Claire noticed it before anyone else because she had known him longest and had specific memories to measure against. She remembered Ethan at 22, unable to send an email without rereading it 11 times. She remembered him bailing on a job interview because he'd convinced himself overnight that he wasn't qualified enough to even try. She remembered the version of her brother who needed 2 days to recover from a passing comment a stranger made about his haircut. That version of Ethan would not have survived the last 6 months unchanged. And yet here he was, quieter, steadier, and carrying that notebook like it was somehow responsible for all of it. She tried asking him directly once, lightly, over the kind of dinner where you test the temperature of a question before committing to it. He just smiled and said it was nothing, just something he was working through. Claire let it go that night, but she didn't stop watching. Over the following weeks, the notebook became something close to a small mystery shared across his entire circle. A coworker tried to glance at a page over his shoulder and reported back that Ethan had closed it too quickly to see anything. A friend joked that he must be writing a tell-all memoir about everyone he knew, and Ethan laughed in a way that didn't really confirm or deny anything, which somehow made it worse. The not knowing fed itself. The less anyone could see, the more they assumed there was something to hide, and the assumption people kept returning to, the one that felt most plausible given how guarded he'd become about it, was that the notebook contained them, their flaws, their mistakes, things he'd noticed and never said. It was Claire who finally asked the real question months later, on an evening when the two of them were the only ones left at their parents' kitchen table after a family dinner had thinned out. "What are you actually writing in that thing?" she said, nodding toward the notebook sitting beside his plate, worn enough now that she noticed it properly for the first time. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at the notebook the way someone looks at an old photograph, like it held more than its size suggested. Then he slid it across the table to her. Claire didn't open it immediately. She found herself looking at it first, really looking, the way you look at something only once you've been given permission to. The cover had gone soft at the edges, the corners rounded from being carried in pockets and bags for what must have been the better part of a year. There were creases along the spine that only come from being opened and closed hundreds of times, in cars and waiting rooms, in the backs of meetings nobody wanted to be in. It felt suddenly heavier than a notebook had any right to feel. And in that pause, every theory she had ever half believed rose up at once. The whispers from coworkers, the worried calls between relatives, the quiet suspicion that maybe he'd been writing about them this whole time, recording slights, building some private ledger of who had disappointed him and how. She thought about every offhand thing she had ever said to her brother, every joke that might have landed wrong, every moment he might have filed away without telling her. Her hand hovered over the cover longer than she meant it to. Part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know what kind of brother she was about to discover. She opened it. The first page held 4 words, written in block letters, pressed hard enough into the paper that they'd nearly torn through. I'm not good enough. She turned the page, expecting it to give way to something else. A name, an observation, anything resembling what she'd braced for. Instead, the next page read, I'll probably fail. The one after that, what will people think? Then, I'm not ready. Then, it's too late. Page after page, the same handwriting, the same urgency, none of it about anyone else at all. There were no names, no grievances, no secrets about coworkers or friends or family. Every single entry was about Ethan, written in the exact moment each thought had occurred to him, dated, sometimes timed down to the hour, as if he'd needed proof that he had actually thought it. Claire looked up at her brother, and for the first time understood that the person Ethan had been documenting all year was not everyone else. It was the version of himself he had been fighting to escape. Ethan explained quietly that he'd started writing it down almost by accident after a conversation that left him unsettled about how often a single sentence in his head could derail an entire day. He began catching the thought instead of obeying it, writing it down the second it appeared instead of letting it run silently underneath everything he did. At first, it felt like nothing, just a strange habit, but months in, a pattern emerged that he hadn't expected. The same fears kept reappearing, word for word, as if some loop had been running in the background of his life for years, dictating decisions he had always believed were entirely his own. He realized slowly and uncomfortably that the voice in that notebook wasn't observation, it was instruction. It had been telling him who to be for a very long time, and he had simply never thought to question whether it was telling the truth. Nothing about Ethan's transformation came from motivation or discipline or some sudden burst of confidence. It came from the unglamorous act of finally seeing the voice that had been running his life without ever asking his permission. Claire closed the notebook gently and sat with it for a moment before sliding it back across the table, because the most dangerous voice in a person's life is rarely the one that shouts. It is the one that sounds exactly like their own thoughts, speaking in their own tone, using their own logic, never once announcing itself as a stranger. Freedom does not begin with silencing that voice. It begins the moment you stop assuming everything it says is true